The sun was a judgment. It hung in the vast, white sky over the Arizona territory like a copper coin someone had heated in a forge, and it beat down on the land with a merciless, personal fury. The heat rose from the cracked earth in shimmering waves, making the distant mesas tremble like ghosts caught between this world and the next. This was a land that wore its bones on the outside, a place that offered no relief and kept a hard tally of every mistake. The saguaro cacti, long dead and stripped to skeletal husks, held their arms up to a sky that never answered, their posture one of perpetual, unanswered prayer. The wind, a patient sculptor, had carved the rust-colored rocks into shapes of agony over 1,000 years, and the sparse, thorny vegetation that clung to life did so with a desperate tenacity that bordered on madness. Through this unforgiving landscape rode Elias Thorne, his sturdy buckskin horse, a creature of similar resilience he called Dust, moved with a steady, ground-eating gait that spoke of long, hard miles. Elias was a man in his early 30s, but the lines carved around his eyes and the tight set of his mouth belonged to someone much older, someone who had seen too many endings. The Civil War had etched some of them in the mud of Virginia, and the cholera that had swept through his small homestead in Missouri had etched the rest. His face was weathered by the sun to the color of old leather, and his clothes were worn and practical, faded by sun and sweat to the muted tones of the desert itself. The Colt Peacemaker holstered on his hip was not an ornament of vanity, but a tool, as familiar and necessary to him as a hammer or an axe. Every movement he made was economical and sure, the quiet competence of a man who had spent years surviving on his own, a man for whom wasted motion was a luxury he could not afford. His inner world was one of weary silence, a landscape as vast and desolate as the one he rode through. It was haunted not by ghosts, but by memories that had the weight and substance of them. Fragments would rise unbidden, the deafening, soul-shaking roar of a cannon battery opening up at dawn, the acrid smell of black powder and blood that clung to everything for days, the pale, feverish face of his wife, Sarah, her eyes pleading with a question he could not answer, the small, hot hand of his son, Thomas, clutching his as a rasping cough shook his little body. He had come west not for adventure, not for gold or for land, but for a kind of oblivion. He sought a place so vast and so quiet that the ghosts of his past might finally grow tired of following him and leave him in peace. He was tracking a mountain lion that had been preying on the few wild deer in the area, a task that required all his focus. He followed the subtle signs, the scrape of a claw on rock, the faint impression of a paw in the hard-packed dirt. The concentration was a balm, pushing the memories back into their dark corners, if only for a little while. As the sun began its slow, bleeding descent toward the horizon, casting shadows as long and distorted as a bad dream, Dust's ears twitched and swiveled. The horse took a nervous, sideways step, its nostrils flaring as it tasted the air. Elias reined him to a halt instantly, his hand falling to rest on the worn wooden handle of his revolver, his senses, honed by war and sharpened by solitude, went on high alert. The air was wrong. The usual evening sounds of the desert, the chirr of insects and the distant call of a quail, were absent. A heavy, unnatural stillness had fallen over the canyon floor, the kind of profound quiet that comes only after a sudden, terrible noise. He swung down from the saddle, his boots making soft, sinking sounds in the thick red dust. He moved forward cautiously, his eyes scanning the rocks and the sparse brush. Then he smelled it, a scent that cut through the clean, dry air with a sickening familiarity. It was the coppery, metallic tang of fresh blood, a smell he had hoped never to encounter in such volume again. It pulled at his memory, bringing with it the old, familiar sickness of battle that rose from the pit of his stomach into his throat. He followed the scent with a grim reluctance, his hand never leaving the butt of his pistol. It led him to a small, rocky arroyo, a dry wash carved into the canyon floor. The scene that waited for him there was one of grim, brutal finality. 3 Apache warriors lay sprawled where they had fallen, their bodies torn and broken by a storm of rifle bullets. There were no signs of a fair fight, no indication of a struggle. This was an ambush, a slaughter devoid of honor. The ground around them was littered with the brass cartridge casings from Henry repeating rifles, the work of white men. A cold knot of anger and disgust tightened in his gut. It was the same damned senseless violence he had ridden 1,000 miles to escape, the same casual disregard for life he had seen in the war. Now it was here, staining the red earth of the one place he had hoped would be his sanctuary. His eyes, methodical and practiced, scanned the grim tableau. He was about to turn away, to ride on and leave this place to the scavengers and the silence, when a flicker of movement near a large cluster of boulders snagged his attention. It was barely perceptible, a slight shift of fabric in the deepening shadows. His every instinct, honed over years of survival, screamed that it was a trap, that a 4th rifle was waiting, aimed at his heart. But something else, a deeper, weary curiosity, a refusal to simply walk away from the unknown, pulled him forward. He drew his Colt, the soft, metallic click of the hammer being cocked sounding as loud as a gunshot in the dead air. He approached the boulders slowly, his body tensed, using the terrain for cover as he moved. Behind the rocks, he found her, a young woman. Apache was slumped against the unyielding stone. She was dressed in a simple doe-skin tunic, now dark and stiff with blood. She was alive, but only just. A deep gash in her upper arm bled freely, and a large, dark bruise was spreading across her temple, swelling the delicate skin. But it was her eyes that struck him first and held him fast. They were open, staring sightlessly forward. A pale, cloudy blue-gray that seemed to look right through him, through the rocks, through the world itself. They held a strange, milky light, but they did not see. He realized with a jolt that she was blind. She did not react to his presence, to the sound of his careful approach. It was not until his shadow fell over her, blocking the last fading warmth of the sun from her face, that she knew she was not alone. She flinched violently, a small, wounded animal sound escaping her lips. Her body tensed, ready to fight or to flee. "Who is there?" she whispered, her voice raspy with thirst and fear. The words were spoken in the Apache tongue, a language he understood from his time as an army scout, a part of his life he preferred to keep buried with the rest. Elias slowly, deliberately, lowered the barrel of his pistol until it pointed at the ground. His own voice, when it came, was a rough, unused thing, rusty from disuse. "I mean you no harm," he answered in her own language, keeping his tone low and even, hoping the sound itself would be more reassuring than the words. "I found the others." He did not need to elaborate. The silence that followed was heavy and profound, filled with the weight of her unasked question. He watched her face, watched as the mask of terror slowly crumbled, giving way to a dawning, devastating grief. Her sightless eyes seemed to search the empty space around her, as if trying to conjure the faces of her companions from the air. A single tear escaped from the corner of one eye and traced a clean, heartbreaking path through the dust and grime on her cheek. In that moment, he felt a pang of something he had not allowed himself to feel in years, not since he had shoveled the dry Missouri dirt over the small bodies of his wife and son. It was a sharp, painful empathy, a recognition of a sorrow that mirrored his own. He knew this kind of loss, the sudden, violent severing of a life that leaves you adrift in a world that no longer makes sense. He did not see an Apache, a native, an enemy. He saw a person, a young woman, shattered by the same kind of senseless brutality that haunted his own memories, the ingrained prejudice of his time, the warnings to steer clear of the Apache, the common knowledge that they were a threat. All of it felt hollow and distant, a stupid lie in the face of her raw, human suffering. He made a decision then, one that went against every hard-won instinct for self-preservation he had honed over the years. He could not leave her here to die. The first interaction was fraught with a tense, fragile mistrust. When he moved closer, intending to inspect her wound, she recoiled, trying to scramble away, her movements clumsy and desperate against the unyielding rock. "Do not touch me," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength from a deep well of defiance. He stopped immediately, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace that she could not see. "Your arm needs tending," he said gently, his voice still low and calm. "You will bleed to death, or the coyotes will find you by morning." He spoke of practical dangers, the only language he truly trusted, the language of survival. "My name is Elias," he added, a simple offering, the only thing he had to give. She was silent for a long time. So long he thought she might have lost consciousness, but he could see the faint rise and fall of her chest. She was listening, not to his words, but to the sound of his voice, the rhythm of his breathing, the way his heavy boots shifted in the sand. Her world was made of sound, of scent, of the feel of the air on her skin, in the texture of his voice. She could sense no aggression, no cruelty, only a deep and abiding weariness that resonated with the exhaustion in her own bones. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Nalin," she whispered, her name a fragile breath in the vast silence. Getting her onto his horse was a slow, difficult, painful process. Every touch was a negotiation, a crossing of a vast divide. He had to explain every move before he made it, his voice a constant, low murmur. "I am going to put my arm behind your back now. I need to lift you. I will try not to hurt your arm." He was unaccustomed to such careful intimacy. His hands were rough, the palms and fingers thick with calluses from years of work with rope and leather and wood. But he tried to be gentle, to make his touch a reassurance rather than a threat. For Nalin. The feel of his hands was her only source of information about the man who had found her. She could feel the controlled strength in his muscles, the steady tension as he lifted her weight. She could smell the scent of leather, dust, and something else, a faint, clean smell of pine soap that clung to his worn shirt. When she was finally seated in front of him on the saddle, the proximity was unnerving for them both. Her body was rigid with fear and pain, her back barely touching his chest, as he gathered the reins and nudged Dust into a slow, careful walk away from that place of death. She said nothing. Her face was a stoic mask that could not quite hide the tremors of shock and grief that racked her small frame. Tremors he could feel through the saddle and through his own body. They rode through the deepening twilight and into the deep, star-dusted dark of the desert night. The journey back to his cabin was slow and arduous, each step of the horse a careful, deliberate placement on the uneven ground. He found himself talking to her intermittently, not expecting a reply, but simply to fill the immense silence and to let her know, in the terrifying darkness of her world, that he was still there. He described the landscape she could not see, his rough voice trying to paint pictures for her with words. He told her about the way the rising moon illuminated the sharp edges of the mesas, turning them to ridges of pure silver against the black sky. He described the silhouette of a lone coyote on a distant ridge, its head thrown back in a silent howl. He pointed out the sudden, startling flight of a nighthawk as it swooped low over the trail in front of them. He found himself noticing details he had long since stopped seeing, the subtle beauty of the harsh land, all in an effort to translate his world into hers. She remained silent, absorbing his voice, her other senses taking in the rhythmic plodding of the horse's hooves, the familiar, comforting creak of the saddle leather, the feel of the cool night air on her skin. This shared journey, wrapped in darkness and the intimate space of the saddle, became the first fragile thread of a connection, woven in a language beyond words, sight, or the deep prejudices of their separate worlds. They arrived at his cabin well after midnight. It was a small, sturdy structure he had built himself, logs chinked with mud, nestled in a hidden cove at the base of a sheer rock wall. Far from any established trails, it was his fortress against the world and against his own memories. inside. The single room was Spartan, but clean. A simple cot was built against one wall. A stone fireplace dominated another. A rough-hewn table and 2 stools stood in the center of the room, and a few shelves held his basic supplies: tins of coffee, sacks of flour and beans, a few books. He eased her off the horse and helped her inside, settling her carefully onto one of the stools by the cold hearth. The air inside was still and smelled of old wood smoke and the dried herbs he kept hanging from the rafters. He lit a lantern, and the small space was filled with a warm, flickering glow. For the first time, he got a clearer look at her. Despite the dirt and the blood, her features were finely wrought, with high cheekbones and a strong, determined jaw that spoke of a deep, inner resilience. Tending to her wound was an act of profound intimacy that made him deeply uncomfortable. He had to cut away the sleeve of her doeskin tunic. He told her what he was doing at every step, his voice a low constant. "I need to cut the cloth to see the wound. The knife is sharp. I will not cut you." His hands, usually so sure and steady with the reins of a horse or the stock of a rifle, felt clumsy and huge as he worked. He cleaned the deep gash with whiskey, the only antiseptic he had. She hissed in pain, a sharp intake of breath, but did not cry out, her stoicism a thing of formidable strength. As he bandaged her arm with clean strips of cloth he tore from one of his own shirts. His calloused fingers brushed against the soft skin of her arm. It was a simple, clinical touch, yet it felt charged with a significance that unnerved him. He was intensely aware of her presence, of her shallow, pained breathing, of the way her muscles tensed under his hands. He worked in a focused silence, his attention absolute. He was a man accustomed to a deep and unbroken solitude, and the presence of this woman, this stranger from another world, in his small, private space was a profound disruption, a stone tossed into the still pool of his quiet life. Later, he made a thin broth for her from dried meat and wild herbs. She had not eaten, and he knew she needed strength to fight off the fever that was likely to come. He guided the spoon to her lips, a gesture that felt both paternal and strangely intimate, a crossing of another boundary. She ate slowly, mechanically at first, then with a desperate, silent hunger. After she was done, he prepared a bed for her on his own cot, the only one he had, while he made a space for himself on the hard-packed dirt floor by the fire. He gave her a blanket, its rough wool a comforting weight, before he turned away to give her privacy in the small room. She spoke, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet cabin. "Thank you." The words were simple, but they carried the immense weight of her ordeal, an acknowledgement of the incredible trust she had placed in this strange white man, this traditional enemy of her people. Elias just nodded into the shadows, unable to form a reply. He sat by the fire, his back to her, watching the flames dance and chase each other up the chimney. The sleeping woman was a still, quiet form in the shadows behind him. He felt the deep, insulating quiet of his solitude had been irrevocably broken, and for the first time in a very long time, he was not entirely sure how he felt about that. The night deepened, the vast desert outside silent and indifferent, and inside the small cabin, 2 people from warring worlds, both adrift in their own private oceans of grief, had found a fragile, temporary truce. The first few days in the cabin unfolded in a slow, quiet dance of healing and cautious discovery. Naylin spent most of the time lost in a deep, fevered sleep, her body fighting the infection in her arm, while her mind retreated from the sharp-edged horror of the ambush. In her sleep, she would sometimes murmur in her own language, fragmented words of loss that Elias could not fully understand, but whose meaning he felt in the pit of his stomach. He watched her, a still form on his cot, her face pale and drawn under her dark hair, and a fierce, unfamiliar protectiveness took root in him. He found himself moving about his small home with a quietness he had not known he possessed, setting down a tin cup without a sound, closing the heavy wooden door with a gentle click. He was constantly, acutely aware of his sleeping guest, her shallow breathing the new rhythm of his isolated world. He filled the long hours with the familiar tasks of survival, but they felt different now. He mended a fraying strap on his saddle, his fingers working the needle and all with a focused precision that kept his thoughts at bay. He meticulously cleaned and oiled his rifle, the familiar scent of the gun oil a small comfort, the cold weight of the weapon a grim reminder of the world outside their door. He went on short, necessary hunting trips, never venturing far. His senses stretched not for game but for any sound from the direction of the cabin. Each time he returned, pushing through the thick brush that concealed his home, he felt a quiet, urgent dread, a fear of what he might find. And each time he stepped through the door and saw her still there, still breathing. A profound relief would wash over him, a feeling so potent it almost frightened him. During her waking hours, which grew longer each day, a fragile routine began to form between them. He would bring her water, helping her lift her head to drink. He would make a thin broth, and she would eat, her strength slowly returning. Twice a day, he would unwrap the bandage on her arm to clean the wound. "I am going to take the bandage off now," he would say, his voice a low, steady murmur. "This may sting some." He described every action, his words a bridge across the darkness that separated them. The cabin became a self-contained world, a sanctuary sealed off from the harsh realities of the unforgiving landscape and the violent, prejudiced societies that had shaped them both. The very air inside seemed thick with unspoken things, the raw, gaping wound of her grief and the old, scarred-over sorrow of his own, the vast, seemingly unbridgeable gulf of their inherent differences, and the constant, simmering danger her presence brought to him. A danger that lay coiled like a snake in the shadows of their small refuge. Slowly, their communication began to move beyond the simple necessities of caretaking. Nayland's other senses, long heightened and refined by the absence of sight, were her primary tools for understanding the man who had saved her. She began to learn him, not by what he said, but by the sounds and scents of his existence. She learned the sound of his footsteps on the packed earth floor, a heavy, measured tread when he was lost in thought, a lighter, quicker step when he was working on some task. She could tell by the sound of his breathing when he was tired or when he was tense. She learned the scent of his presence, a complex mixture of sun on canvas, worn leather, wood smoke, and the faint, clean smell of the pine soap he used. This sensory information wove itself into a portrait of him, a portrait more detailed and intimate than sight could ever provide. One afternoon, as she sat on a stool in the open doorway, her face turned up to feel the warmth of the sun on her skin. He returned from checking the snares he had set in the nearby brush. He had caught a rabbit. He stopped in front of her, and for a moment, she felt the silence of his stillness. Instead of just telling her of his success, he knelt beside her. "This is what will be for our dinner," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Then, he gently took her hand and placed it on the rabbit's body. The fur was incredibly soft, the dense, downy coat a marvel of texture. The animal's body was still warm, though the life was fading from it. It was a simple, profound act, a gesture that marked a significant shift in their relationship. He was beginning to understand how to communicate with her in her own sensory language, to share the world with her not as he saw it, but as she might feel it. From that day on, he started describing the world to her not just in terms of sight, but in terms of texture, sound, and smell. He brought her a sprig of sagebrush, its leaves like dusty, brittle velvet. "Crush it," he urged. She rolled the leaves between her fingers, and the air filled with the sharp, clean, medicinal scent of the desert. "Its color is a dusty silver green," he told her, "the color of the air just before the sun rises." He let her feel the rough, corrugated bark of the firewood he brought in, describing the deep fissures and ridges. He placed a smooth, cool river stone in her palm, its weight a satisfying presence, and told her how 1,000 years of water had made it so perfect. He was giving her back pieces of the world, and in doing so, he was seeing it anew himself. In return for his efforts, Nayland began to slowly, cautiously open up. Her initial fear and deep-seated mistrust, born of a lifetime of experience, began to recede, replaced by a tentative curiosity about this quiet, solitary man. She began to teach him things that he, for all his skill as a tracker and a scout, had never known. She taught him how to truly listen to the desert, to distinguish the low moan of the wind as it passed through a narrow canyon from the high, sighing whisper of the wind across an open plain. One evening, hearing a frantic fluttering sound outside, he reached for his rifle, thinking it was a rattlesnake. "No," she said, her voice calm. "It is only a moth, a large one. Their wings make a sound like dry leaves skittering." She could identify different birds by the sound of their wing beats alone, a skill that left him in awe. Standing barefoot outside the cabin, she could tell by the feel of the ground, the subtle vibrations and the texture of the soil, where water might be found deep below the surface. She possessed a connection to the land that was deeper and more intuitive than his own, a relationship built on a language he was only just beginning to learn. In the evenings, sitting by the fire, she started to share stories of her childhood, small, poignant anecdotes that revealed the profound and painful loneliness of her existence. Her father, the chief, loved her fiercely, she explained, but his love was a protective shield that also kept her separate. Within their tribe, the Chokonen band of the Chiricahua, many viewed her blindness not as a simple physical condition, but as a spiritual weakness, a bad omen, a shadow on her soul. She was often excluded from the loud, boisterous games of the other children, their laughter fading as they ran off, leaving her behind in a world of sound and silence. As she grew into a woman, no warrior sought to bond with her. She was seen as a liability rather than a partner, someone to be protected rather than a pillar of strength to stand beside. Her world, even among her own people, the only people she had ever known, had been one of deep and profound isolation. Nurtured by the quiet intimacy and the complete isolation of the cabin, a powerful emotional bond began to grow between them, a bond that frightened them both with its intensity. One evening, a sudden thunderstorm, a rare and violent event in the dry season, rolled in from the west. The sky, which had been clear moments before, turned a bruised purple-black. The sky cracked open with a deafening clap of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the small cabin, and rain, thick as a curtain, began to lash against the roof and walls. The sudden, violent, and unpredictable noise was a sensory assault that terrified Nalin. She curled into herself on the cot, trembling, her hands over her ears as if she could block out the chaos that had engulfed her world. Elias, seeing her acute distress, moved to the cot and sat on the floor beside her, not touching her at first. He began to speak, his voice a low, steady counterpoint to the storm's unrelenting fury. He did not offer empty reassurances or tell her not to be afraid. Instead, he began to describe the storm to her as he saw it, giving a shape and a form to the terrifying sounds. "That roar," he said, his voice rising just enough to be heard over the din. "That is the rain hitting the thirsty earth. In a moment, you will be able to smell it, the scent of dust and life." And she could. A rich, clean scent of creote and wet earth filled the small cabin. That crackle, the one that sounds like a tree splitting apart, that is a jagged spear of lightning. For a split second, it illuminates the entire sky, turning the night to brilliant day. There is a terrible power in it, but also a kind of beauty. He was giving her a way to see the storm, to understand it, to anchor herself in the chaos. Hesitantly, he reached out and took her hand. His touch was solid, warm, and grounding. She clung to it, her small hand gripping his with a desperate strength. Her fear slowly began to subside as she focused on the anchor of his presence, the steady calm of his voice, and the incredible images he painted for her with his words. In that moment, surrounded by the storm's magnificent fury, their physical contact became something more than comfort. It was a profound connection, a silent acknowledgement of the shelter, both physical and emotional, that they had found in each other. The desire that had been simmering just beneath the surface of their careful, gentle interactions began to intensify, growing into a fire that threatened to consume them both. For Elias, it was a feeling he thought had died with his wife, an emotion he had buried so deep he believed it could never be resurrected. He found himself watching Nalin, captivated by the way she would tilt her head to listen to some distant sound, the unconscious grace in her careful, deliberate movements, the quiet, unyielding strength that emanated from her like heat from a fire. He was drawn not just to her physical beauty, but to her spirit, to the incredible resilience that had allowed her to survive not only the brutal ambush, but a lifetime of being an outsider. His desire was hopelessly mingled with a fierce, almost painful protectiveness. For Nalin, her attraction to Elias was a tapestry woven from 1,000 non-visual cues. It was the deep sense of safety she felt in his presence, a feeling she had never known before. It was the gentle, rumbling timbre of his voice when he described a sunset to her, painting the colors for her with his words. It was the way he seemed to anticipate her needs without her ever having to speak them. He was the first person, the first man, who truly saw her. Not her blindness, he saw her strength. He valued her wisdom, and he was not afraid of it. This burgeoning attraction was terrifying for both of them, a treacherous and forbidden emotion in a world that would condemn it utterly, a world that would surely seek to destroy them if it ever found them out. The delicate, fragile bubble of their isolated world was inevitably pierced by the sharp point of necessity. Elias was running low on the essentials: salt, flour, and, most critically, ammunition for his rifle. He had no choice. He had to go to the nearby settlement, a dusty, sun-baked prospector town optimistically named Redemption. The thought of leaving Nalin alone, even for a day, filled him with a cold dread he could not shake. He explained the situation to her, his voice carefully neutral, promising that he would be back before the next sunset. He spent the morning making sure she had plenty of water and food within easy reach. Before he left, he barricaded the door from the outside with a heavy log, but showed her how it was braced in a way that she could easily push it free from within. It was a silent agreement, a shared acknowledgement of the danger they both felt. For Nalin, the silence of the cabin after the sound of his horse's hoofbeats faded was immense and terrifying. It was a different kind of silence from the one she was used to. Every creak of the cabin's wood, every gust of wind whistling through the rocks outside, sounded like a threat. His absence made her realize, with a sudden, aching clarity, how much she had come to depend on his presence, not just for her survival, but for companionship. The solitude she had known in her village, a constant, familiar ache, felt different from this new, sharp loneliness. Redemption was a microcosm of all the harshness and brutality of the West. It was little more than a single dusty street lined with a saloon, a general store, and a blacksmith's forge, all of it baking under the oppressive sun. The very air was thick with suspicion and the casual, thoughtless cruelty that was a part of the frontier. As Elias pushed open the door of the general store, the desultory conversation among the patrons, a few grizzled prospectors and a couple of ranch hands, dried up as if a tap had been turned off. They watched him with narrowed, hostile eyes. He was a loner, a man who kept to himself, and in this world, that made him an object of deep suspicion. As he gathered his supplies, moving silently through the cluttered store, he overheard snippets of conversation, spoken in low, agitated tones. They were talking about the Apache problem. The men were angry, speaking of stolen cattle and missing travelers. Elias listened, a cold, familiar feeling growing in the pit of his stomach. He recognized the rhetoric. It was the kind of talk that precedes violence, the kind of talk that men use to justify their hatred. His worst fears were confirmed a few moments later when a group of rough-looking men swaggered into the store, their spurs jingling, their voices loud and arrogant. He recognized their leader instantly, Silas Croft. Croft was a wealthy cattle baron who had been buying up land all over the territory, a man known for his ruthless methods and his cold ambition. He was a large, imposing man with cold, predatory eyes and a cruel twist to his mouth. With him were the men who worked his ranch, hard cases with the look of gunslingers, not cowboys. They were bragging openly, their laughter echoing in the small store, about a recent skirmish. One of the men, a loudmouth with a stained mustache, began to describe ambushing a small Apache scouting party in a canyon not far from where Elias had his cabin. He laughed as he described how they had scattered the savages, how it had not been much of a fight. Elias listened, his hand tightening around the heavy sack of flour in his grip until his knuckles were white bone. He knew, with a sickening, absolute certainty, that these were the men who had killed Nolan's companions, the men who had left her for dead. He kept his head down, his face a neutral, unreadable mask. But inside, a cold, hard rage was solidifying, a rage he had not felt since the war. He paid for his goods, his movements stiff and controlled, and left the store as quickly as he could. The men's callous, brutal laughter followed him out into the oppressive heat of the street. The knowledge of their guilt was a heavy, physical weight upon him. He now understood that Nolan was not just the victim of some random, thoughtless act of frontier violence. She was a survivor of a calculated attack, and the threat was not over. The world was coming for them. He swung up onto his horse, his face grim, his small, hidden cabin. The sanctuary he had so carefully built might not be a sanctuary for much longer. He rode back with a new, desperate urgency. The fragile peace of the last few weeks shattered into 1,000 pieces. Elias rode back to the cabin with a grim and terrible purpose. The dusty, sun-baked streets of redemption and the cruel, hollow laughter of Silas Croft's men echoing in the chambers of his mind. The sanctuary he had built, both the physical cabin of wood and stone and the emotional shelter he had found with Nolan, now felt terrifyingly fragile. A house of glass in a world full of stones. The knowledge of what those men had done, and the casual pride with which they had confessed it, was a poison that had seeped into his soul. He pushed dust harder than he normally would, the horse's powerful legs eating up the miles as the setting sun painted the western sky in bloody streaks of crimson and orange, a violent, beautiful reflection of the turmoil in his own heart. The world was no longer a place of quiet oblivion. It was a hunting ground, and he and Nayland were the prey. When he finally reached the hidden cove, he did not ride directly to the cabin. The old, deeply ingrained instincts of his Army Scout days took over. He dismounted while still under the cover of the thick pines, tethering dust where he would not be seen. He approached on foot, his movements as silent and fluid as a shadow, his eyes scanning for any sign of disturbance, any track that was not his own, his ears straining against the evening quiet. The silence of the canyon was absolute, unbroken by any sound but the whisper of the wind through the rocks. A profound, almost overwhelming relief washed over him when he saw the cabin, undisturbed, a thin curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. He had not realized until that moment the depth of his fear, the cold, tight knot of it that had been sitting in his chest for hours. Inside, Nayland was sitting perfectly still on the cot, her body as taut as a drawn bowstring. She had been listening to the sound of his approaching hoofbeats for the last 10 minutes, her entire being focused on that single, hopeful sound. The moment he spoke her name, a single, soft word in the quiet of the room, the tension flowed out of her in a rush. She sagged, her shoulders slumping, and she nearly collapsed with a relief so profound it was almost painful. Their reunion was charged with unspoken emotion, a desperate gladness that needed no words. He did not tell her about the men in town, about the confirmation of his fears. To speak of it would be to give the evil a name, to invite it into their sanctuary, and he could not bring himself to add that burden to her own. But his demeanor had changed, and she, who read the world through sound and feeling, sensed it immediately. A new gravity had settled over him, a fierce, protective edge that she could hear in the controlled quietness of his movements, in the harder, deeper tone of his voice. The peace of their isolated world had been broken, and though she did not know why, She knew that the danger was no longer a vague possibility, but a real and present threat. Their relationship deepened in the wake of this new, unspoken peril. The time for slow, gentle discovery was over, burned away by the harsh reality of the world that lay just beyond their hidden cove. Their days were now filled with a sense of stolen moments, a desperate need to live and feel in the small sliver of time they might have left. The intensity of their feelings, long suppressed by caution and the deep chasm of their different worlds, could no longer be contained. One evening, they sat outside the cabin door as the last light faded and the immense, star-dusted canopy of the desert night revealed itself. He was describing the stars to her, his voice a low, intimate murmur in the vast quiet. He spoke of the constellations, the old stories his father had told him about the hunter and the bear. He described the Milky Way, not as a band of distant stars, but as a spilled river of light that had been flung across the blackness of the sky. As he spoke, she reached out, her movement hesitant but sure, and touched his face. Her fingers, delicate and sensitive, gently traced the hard line of his jaw, the weary lines around his mouth, his lips. It was a gesture of incredible bravery and profound vulnerability. It was not the touch of a patient to a caretaker, or a victim to her rescuer. It was the touch of a woman to a man she was beginning to love. Elias froze, his breath catching in his throat. The touch was like a spark on dry tinder, igniting something deep within him that he thought had long ago turned to ash. For years, grief and a self-imposed, punishing isolation had built thick, high walls around his heart. Her touch did not break them down. It simply dismantled them, stone by careful stone, until there was nothing left but the raw, aching core of him. He leaned into her hand, his eyes closing, overwhelmed by a feeling of coming home that he had been certain he would never experience again. He took her hand in his, turned it over, and held her palm against his rough, unshaven cheek, a silent answer to her unspoken question. The air in the small space between them became thick and heavy with a palpable, aching desire, a longing so powerful it was a physical presence. This newfound, fragile intimacy was shattered by the brutal arrival of the outside world. One morning, just after dawn, Elias was outside the cabin, the rhythmic, sharp chunk of his axe splitting firewood echoing in the cool morning air. A sudden sixth sense, a prickling on the back of his neck, made him stop mid-swing. He looked up, his eyes scanning the edge of the clearing. They were there. 3 Apache warriors on horseback, their figures silhouetted against the rising sun, their forms dark and menacing. They were armed with rifles, and their faces were grim, streaked with the stark, bold lines of war paint. They had found him. His heart plummeted into his boots. He knew exactly what this looked like. A white man, an enemy, with a missing woman from their tribe, a woman of importance. He slowly, deliberately, placed his axe on the chopping block and raised his hands in a universal gesture of peace, his palms open and empty. The warriors dismounted, their movements fluid and predatory, a silent, coordinated threat. Their leader, a tall, powerfully built warrior whose face was marked by a long, jagged scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, stepped forward. "Where is she?" The warrior, Cale, demanded, his voice a harsh, accusatory growl. "What have you done with the daughter of our chief?" Nalin, hearing the strange, hostile voices, emerged from the cabin. She moved carefully but without hesitation into the bright morning sunlight, her face pale but perfectly composed. The 3 warriors stopped dead, their expressions a volatile mixture of shock, profound relief, and deep, ingrained suspicion. Seeing her alive and unharmed was one thing, but seeing her emerge from this white man's cabin, looking healthy and cared for, her arm neatly bandaged, complicated the simple, violent narrative of abduction they had imagined. Cale's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking from Nalin's calm face to the clean bandage on her arm, to Elias's empty, raised hands. He saw no signs of a struggle, no indication that she was a prisoner. "Nalin," he said, his voice softer now, but still laced with a sharp edge of suspicion. "This man, did he harm you?" It was a pivotal, life-altering moment. The world seemed to hold its breath. Nalin's next words would either save Elias's life or condemn him to a swift and brutal death. She turned her face in the direction of Elias's tense, still form, and then back to the warriors. "This man is Elias," she said, and her voice was clear and strong, ringing with a newfound authority that stunned the warriors who had only known her as the quiet, withdrawn, blind girl. "He found me after the ambush. The men who killed our brothers left me to die. He saved my life. He has shown me only kindness." Her defense was absolute, unequivocal, yet it did little to quell the deep well of their mistrust. They saw a white man, and their people had known nothing but betrayal and violence from his kind for generations. They saw a blind woman, and in their fear and grief, they questioned her judgment, her ability to perceive the true nature of the situation. They believed her spirit, if not her body, had been taken captive. Kale, his face a mask of grim resolve, insisted that Elias come with them back to their camp. It was not a request, it was a command. Nalin protested, her voice rising with a desperate urgency, but she was overruled. Elias, seeing the cold, unyielding certainty in their eyes, knew that resistance would be a death sentence for them both. He agreed to go, but not before his eyes met Nalin's. A tense, silent negotiation passing between them in which he made it clear that he was doing this only for her safety, a strategic surrender to protect the one thing in the world he now valued. The journey to the Apache camp was a long, silent, miserable ordeal. Elias was a prisoner, his hands tied loosely in front of him with a leather thong, the reins of his horse held by one of the warriors. He was surrounded by a deep, implacable hostility that was as tangible as the heat of the sun on his back. They rode for hours, deeper into the rugged, broken country than he had ever been. He observed everything, his mind working with a cold, detached clarity. He memorized the landscape, the subtle signs of their trail, the wary, sidelong glances the warriors exchanged with one another. When they finally arrived at the camp, a large settlement of wickiups and cook fires hidden deep within a network of intersecting canyons, he was met with a sea of hostile, unforgiving faces. The news of Nalin's return spread through the camp like a wildfire, a wave of relief and celebration. But that news was immediately followed by the dark shadow of the second piece of news, the white man she had brought with her. He was paraded through the center of the camp, a public spectacle of their enemy captured. He was then tied to a sturdy post in the middle of the village and left for all to see. He was a symbol of the enemy, an object for their fear and hatred. Children stared at him with a mixture of terror and morbid curiosity. The women whispered behind their hands, their dark eyes filled with contempt. The warriors glowered at him, their hatred a palpable, living force in the air. Nalin was immediately taken to her father, Chief Dasoda. He was a formidable man, his face a testament to a long and difficult life of war and leadership, every line a story of sorrow or survival. He embraced his daughter, his immense relief and profound love for her warring with his grave concern over the situation she had brought upon them. The council of elders was convened in the chief's lodge. Nalin, standing before them, once again recounted her story, this time defending Elias with a passionate, desperate eloquence. She spoke of his gentleness, his honor, his kindness in the face of her vulnerability. But the council was swayed by the fresh, raw grief of the ambush. They had just buried 3 of their own, 3 fine young men. Their sorrow was a fire that needed fuel. Another warrior stood and spoke of recent cattle raids in the area, raids for which the white settlers were blaming them, increasing the already dangerous tensions. Elias, simply by virtue of the color of his skin, became the focal point for all their fear, their anger, and their bottomless grief. Many of the warriors, their hearts hardened by loss, called for his immediate death as retribution. a life for the lives they had lost. Chief DeSoto was caught in an impossible, agonizing position. He loved his daughter and, looking into her face, he trusted the truth of her instincts. But he was also a leader, responsible for the survival and well-being of his people. To show any leniency to a white man, especially now, could be seen as a grave weakness, a betrayal that could endanger them all. He decided on a difficult compromise, a decision that satisfied no one. Elias would not be killed. Not yet. He would be kept as a prisoner, his ultimate fate to be decided later. He must prove his worth, prove that he was not like the other white men who had brought them nothing but pain. Elias was moved from the public post to a guarded wickiup at the edge of the camp. He was given food and water, but he was a complete outcast, treated with a venomous contempt by all who passed. He endured the insults, the spit, and the naked hatred with a stoic, unreadable calm. He understood its source. It was not personal. It was the collective pain of a people pushed to the brink of extinction. His thoughts, however, were constantly on Nalin. He worried for her, worried for how his presence was affecting her standing within the tribe, how his shadow was falling over her life. The days that followed were a brutal test of his endurance. He was put to work doing the most menial, back-breaking tasks in the camp. He proved his worth not through words, which would have been useless, but through quiet, consistent action. He was an expert tracker, and he helped a frustrated hunting party find a small herd of deer in a place they had thought barren, his skills saving them days of fruitless searching. He knew how to set broken bones, a grim skill learned on the bloody battlefields of the war, and he used that knowledge to help a young boy who had fallen from a horse, his gentle, competent hands calming the boy's fear and his parents' panic. These actions earned him a few grudging glances of respect from a handful of the elders, but they did not change the fundamental, unchangeable fact of his otherness. His only solace was Nalin. She visited him when she could, usually in the evening, under the watchful, suspicious eye of a guard. She would bring him food and speak to him in low, hurried tones, her presence a balm to his weary soul. These stolen moments were a lifeline for them both, a desperate affirmation of their bond in a world determined to deny it. But their connection did not go unnoticed, and it only served to fuel the tribe's suspicion. They saw the bond between the chief's blind daughter and the white prisoner, and many saw it as a profound betrayal, a sign that her loyalties were divided. The fragile, unstable truce was shattered by a devastating, calculated tragedy. Miles away, Silas Croft grew impatient. The tensions were simmering, but he needed a full boil. He needed to escalate the conflict, to create an incident so horrific that it would force the army's hand and give him the pretext he needed to claim the Apache's land. He ordered his men to attack a small, peaceful Apache hunting party that had ventured close to what he now considered his territory. It was not a raid. It was a slaughter. They killed everyone, 8 people in all, including a wise old woman who had been a mentor and a friend to Nalin, and a strong young warrior who was Cale's younger brother. Croft's men committed unspeakable acts, arranging the scene to look like a raid gone wrong at the hands of settlers. The few who escaped and brought the news back to the camp were hysterical with grief and rage. The camp exploded in a firestorm of sorrow and fury. In an instant, all the small, painstaking progress Elias had made was erased, burned to ashes by this new tragedy. He was once again the face of the enemy, the embodiment of the treacherous, murderous white man. A group of warriors, led by the grief-stricken, half-mad Cale, dragged him from his lodging. They beat him severely, their fists and feet a desperate, unfocused expression of their unbearable pain. Before Chief DeSoto's personal guards could intervene and pull them away, the call for his death was now a deafening, unified roar that echoed through the canyons. The love story that had begun in the quiet, gentle intimacy of the hidden cabin had now collided with the full, brutal force of a world determined to tear them apart, and the first taste of its tragic consequences was bitter and bloody. In the immediate aftermath of the second massacre, The Apache camp descended into a maelstrom of grief and rage. The air, once filled with the sounds of daily life, grew thick with the keening wails of women. The sorrow so raw and profound it seemed to take on a physical weight. The death chants, ancient and mournful, echoed off the high canyon walls, a constant, haunting chorus for the freshly dead. Elias, his body a canvas of bruises and cuts from the beating, was once again a prisoner in the truest and most absolute sense. He was confined to the dark, smoky wickiup, now under the heavy, hostile guard of two warriors who watched his every move with open hatred. The tentative, fragile respect he had so painstakingly earned through his actions was gone, burned to ash in the fires of this new tragedy. In the eyes of the tribe, he was now inextricably linked to the murderers of their people, his white skin the very uniform of their enemy. Cale, his face a mask of cold, unforgiving fury over the loss of his younger brother, became his chief tormentor. His grief had found a single, sharp focus. He saw in Elias the embodiment of all his pain, the living symbol of the treacherous world that had taken everything from him. He argued passionately and relentlessly before the council, his voice shaking with a righteous anger. To keep the white man alive, he thundered, was a profound insult to the spirits of the dead and a clear and present danger to the living. He advocated for a swift and brutal execution, a blood payment that he believed was the only path to justice. Nalin was thrust into a desperate and terrible isolation. Her unwavering defense of Elias now marked her as a traitor in the eyes of many. The whispers followed her through the camp like a foul wind. They said the white man had poisoned her mind with his soft words, that her blindness, always a source of suspicion for some, had finally made her a fool, incapable of seeing the truth. Even the small children who had once approached her with affection, drawn to the gentle sound of her voice, now shied away as she passed, their parents pulling them back with fearful glances. She was more alone than she had ever been, an outcast among her own people. But the prejudice and suspicion she faced did not break her. It only hardened her resolve, forging her sorrow and her love into a weapon of unyielding conviction. She confronted her father in his lodge, her small frame trembling not with fear, but with a righteous anger that made her seem taller, stronger. She reminded him of his own wisdom, of the times he had spoken to the council of judging a man by the strength of his heart and the truth of his actions, not by the color of his skin. "If we kill him," she insisted, her voice clear and ringing in the tense silence of the lodge. "If we answer murder with murder, then how are we better than the men who slaughtered our people? We will become the thing we hate." Chief DeSoto was a man torn in two. He was a leader who must answer to his people's agonized cry for vengeance, a cry that was growing louder and more insistent with every passing hour. But he was also a father who saw the undeniable truth in his daughter's words, and who recognized the profound, impossible love she had for this outsider. In the end, he did the only thing he could do. He postponed Elias's fate, declaring that no decision would be made until the days of mourning were complete. It was a decision that satisfied no one. It enraged the warriors and worried the elders, and it placed him under an immense and crushing pressure. In the shadows of this immense and suffocating hostility, their forbidden love did not wither. It flourished. Their connection, now denied any public expression, became a secret, desperate affair. Nalin began to visit Elias in the dead of night, guided by her flawless memory of the camp's layout and the heightened, sensitive instruments of her other senses. She moved like a ghost through the sleeping village. She could hear the soft, rhythmic breathing of the guards, could tell by the subtle shift in the air when they were distracted or on the verge of sleep. She would slip into his wickiup, a silent shadow in the deep darkness. These secret meetings were fraught with a terrible peril. Discovery would mean certain death for him and utter, permanent disgrace for her. The constant danger made their encounters incredibly potent, each moment precious and sharp. In the absolute darkness of the small shelter, the outside world with all its hatred and its sorrow fell away. There was only the sound of their breathing, the warmth of their bodies, the gentle, seeking touch of their hands. They did not speak much. Words felt clumsy and inadequate for the depth of their feelings and the immense sorrow of their situation. Their communication was one of touch, of presence. Her delicate fingers would gently trace the cuts and bruises on his face. Each touch a silent apology for her people's actions, a reaffirmation of her belief in him. She, in turn, offered him the powerful comfort of her unwavering faith, a solace he desperately needed as he sat in the darkness, waiting for a death sentence. Their desire, sharpened to a razor's edge by the constant threat of loss, finally culminated in a moment of profound, sorrowful passion. One night, the weight of their impossible situation, the crushing grief, and the looming threat of his execution became too much to bear. Naylin came to him, her face wet with silent tears, tears shed for her murdered friends, for her lost brother-in-law, and for the beautiful, doomed love that had grown between them. In the shared, sacred space of their grief, they found a desperate, overwhelming need for life, for a powerful affirmation of their existence against the relentless tide of death that surrounded them. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her as if he could shield her from all the pain in the world. In the darkness, they made love for the first time. It was not a gentle or easy union. It was fierce and desperate, a clinging to one another in a world that was trying with all its might to rip them apart. It was an act of ultimate defiance, a claim they staked on their own lives and their own hearts in the face of a world that had denied them any right to either. For a few brief, stolen hours, they created a world that belonged only to them, a moment of transcendent, heartbreaking beauty and connection amidst the profound ugliness of their reality. They both knew, even as they held each other in the aftermath, their bodies slick with sweat, their hearts pounding in unison, that this act could seal their fate. But in that moment, the risk felt insignificant compared to the desperate, fundamental need to feel, to love, and to be truly, completely alive. Meanwhile, miles away in the dusty town of Redemption, Silas Croft escalated his campaign of terror. The massacre of the hunting party had stoked the fires of hatred, but it was not enough. He needed a full-blown inferno, an incident so shocking it would turn the entire white population of the territory against the Apache and force the United States Army to remove them permanently, leaving their land and its precious water rights for him to claim. He orchestrated a raid on a small, isolated homestead belonging to a quiet family of German settlers. He and his men, their faces disguised with crude Apache markings and streaks of war paint, descended on the farm in the dead of night. They burned the small cabin to the ground, stole the livestock, and brutally killed the family, leaving behind a few carefully planted Apache arrows in the bodies of the victims. The sole survivor, one of Croft's own men, his face smeared with soot and his arm bleeding from a self-inflicted wound, rode into Redemption the next day with a harrowing, brilliantly fabricated tale of a brutal, savage attack. The news spread like wildfire, igniting a firestorm of panic and hatred throughout the territory. The story was printed in the territorial newspaper, embellished with lurid, horrifying details of Apache cruelty. All of it completely false. Years of simmering prejudice, fear, and resentment boiled over. Vigilante groups formed overnight, their members drunk on whiskey and righteous fury. The cry for military intervention became a deafening roar. The local Indian agent, a weak-willed man who was already on Silas Croft's payroll, sent an urgent telegram to the nearest army post, Fort Grant, painting a terrifying picture of a full-scale Apache uprising led by the supposedly bloodthirsty Chief DeSoto. The territorial government, always eager to open up more land for settlement and ranching, pressured the army to act swiftly and decisively. A detachment of United States cavalry was dispatched from Fort Grant, led by a young, ambitious, and deeply prejudiced captain named Arthur Wallace. Wallace was a man who saw the Indian Wars not as a tragedy, but as a fast track to promotion and glory. He was impatient with nuance, viewing all Native Americans as obstacles to progress, and he was eager for a decisive, headline-grabbing victory. When he and his troops arrived in Redemption, he was met by Silas Croft, who presented himself as a humble, concerned citizen and a grieving victim of Apache aggression. Croft masterfully manipulated the young captain, feeding his ego, confirming his prejudices, and feeding him a steady stream of misinformation. He guided Wallace away from any evidence that might contradict his story and played expertly on his ambition. As a final, brilliant stroke, he offered his own men to serve as scouts for the cavalry, ensuring that he could lead the soldiers exactly where he wanted them to go, straight to DeSoto's hidden camp. Elias, from the dark confines of his wickiup, sensed the shift in the world outside. The Apache scouts who ventured out from the camp returned with grim news of increased military patrols and of the rising hysterical anger in the white settlements. He knew, with the cold, sick certainty of a former soldier, exactly what was coming. The pattern was tragically, horribly familiar. A manufactured incident, followed by public outrage, followed by a punitive military expedition that rarely distinguished between the guilty and the innocent. He tried to warn Chief DeSoto, speaking urgently to Nalin during her secret nightly visits. He explained military tactics, the devastating power of their repeating rifles and their disciplined volley fire. He described the ruthless, inexorable logic of their campaigns. He urged DeSoto, through Nalin, to move the tribe immediately, to flee deeper into the labyrinthine mountains before the soldiers could find them. But DeSoto's hands were tied. The tribe was shattered by grief and hopelessly divided. To run now, in the face of the accusations about the murdered settler family, would be seen by the whites as an admission of guilt. Cale and the other young warriors, their hearts consumed by a desire for revenge and a longing for an honorable death, were clamoring for a fight. They were eager to meet the soldiers in battle, to die fighting for their land and their honor. They saw Elias's warnings not as sound tactical advice, but as the treacherous words of an enemy, a clever trick designed to weaken their resolve and make them appear as cowards. DeSoto, caught in an impossible position between his daughter's desperate, logical pleas and the passionate war cries of his warriors, hesitated. It was a fatal hesitation. The noose that Silas Croft had so carefully and cunningly fashioned was tightening around them all. The love between Elias and Nalin, which had begun as a private rebellion against the hatred of their worlds, was now at the very epicenter of a looming public tragedy. They were trapped, not just by the unyielding rock walls of the canyon, but by the relentless, converging forces of hatred, greed, and a world that had no place for them. Their darkest hour was approaching, riding toward them on the wind. The dawn broke with a deceptive and heartbreaking tranquility. The sky over the canyon rim a soft, painterly palette of gray and rose, but an unnatural quiet, a heavy and expectant stillness, hung over the Apache camp. The birds, usually a riot of song at this hour, were silent. High above, perched on a rocky outcrop that gave him a view of the valley below, a young scout felt the wrongness of the morning. He scanned the landscape, his eyes sharp and practiced. And then he saw it, a single, brilliant glint of sunlight on polished metal, far down the valley. It was followed by another, and another. He let out a sharp, piercing warning cry, a sound that sliced through the morning calm like a knife. The camp erupted from sleep directly into chaos. The scouts' cry was the sound of their deepest fears made real. Warriors, their faces still creased with sleep, scrambled for their weapons. Old rifles and bows that were no match for what was coming. Women, their faces masks of terror, grabbed their sleeping children and whatever meager possessions they could carry in their arms, trying to flee from the center of the camp to the relative safety of the higher caves carved into the canyon walls. The attack they had been warned about, the one they had both dreaded and, in the angry, grief-stricken corners of their hearts, longed for, was upon them. Captain Arthur Wallace, guided with deadly precision by Silas Croft and his men, had positioned his troops perfectly during the night, sealing the camp's main entrance in an iron ring of soldiers. He had no intention of negotiating, of demanding surrender, or of taking prisoners. fueled by Croft's carefully constructed lies and his own ravenous hunger for a decisive, career-making victory. He had come for nothing less than extermination. He raised his hand, held it for a dramatic beat, and then brought it down. The first volley of rifle fire ripped through the unsuspecting camp without warning. A single, deafening crack of thunder that echoed endlessly in the narrow canyon, multiplying itself until it sounded as if the very mountains were tearing themselves apart. The bullets, fired in a coordinated, disciplined wave, tore through the thin leather walls of the wickiups and through human flesh with an indiscriminate, mechanical fury. Men, women, and children, caught in the open as they ran from their lodges, fell in the first few terrible seconds. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter, a cold and calculated reaping of human lives. In the confusion, 2 of the 3 guards at Elias's wickiup, their duty as warriors overriding their duty as jailers, grabbed their rifles and ran to join the fray. They left only one, a young warrior, barely a man, whose face was a mask of pure terror and confusion. He stood frozen, his rifle held loosely in his hands, staring at the carnage unfolding before him. Elias knew this was his only chance, his only hope. He had to get to Nolan. He used the deafening chaos as cover, surging forward and tackling the young guard, taking him to the ground in a swift, efficient move born of brutal battlefield experience. He did not kill him. He slammed the boy's head against the hard-packed earth, just hard enough to render him unconscious, grabbing the warrior's knife from its sheath and his rifle. Elias burst out from the wickiup and into the heart of the carnage. The scene before him was a living nightmare, a hellscape of swirling, acrid smoke, the constant panicked screams of the wounded and the dying, and the unending, deafening roar of gunfire. He saw uniformed soldiers on horseback charging into the camp, their faces grim and set, firing their pistols down into groups of fleeing families, and he saw Silas Croft's men, distinct from the soldiers in their civilian clothes, moving through the chaos with a cold, methodical brutality, their faces alight with a terrible excitement as they went about the business of finishing off the wounded. The air was thick and heavy, cloying with the smell of black powder and fresh blood. His only thought was Nolan. The name was a mantra, a single point of focus in the overwhelming maelstrom. He began to fight his way through the chaos, using his intimate knowledge of the camp's layout that she had so carefully described to him in the quiet darkness of his cabin. He moved like a ghost, sticking to the shadows, using the burning lodges for cover. His military training, the source of so much of his past pain, was now a grim and terrible asset. He shot only when he had to, conserving the precious few cartridges in the warrior's rifle, his targets chosen with a cold, deadly precision. The soldiers or craftsmen who were actively killing non-combatants, women and children who had no means to defend themselves. He was not fighting for a side, he was fighting for one person. He found her near her father's lodge. Chief DeSoto was trying to rally the few remaining warriors who had survived the initial onslaught, forming a desperate rearguard to buy a few precious moments for the others to escape up the treacherous canyon paths. Naylin was huddled against the cold rock wall of the canyon, her hands pressed over her ears, her body trembling uncontrollably. She was disoriented and terrified by the cacophony of violence that had engulfed her world, the sounds, the smells, the very vibrations in the earth beneath her feet. It was an overwhelming sensory assault that had completely shattered her composure. The tragic climax of the battle, the end of a people's way of life, unfolded before his eyes in a matter of seconds. Chief DeSoto, fighting with the fierce, desperate courage of a man defending his home, his family, and his people, was cut down by a disciplined volley of rifle fire from a line of dismounted soldiers. He fell without a cry, his body crumpling to the dust, his sudden death marking the final, definitive end of his people's resistance. Nolan, huddled against the rock, did not see him fall, but she heard it. In the constant din of battle, she heard the sudden and absolute cessation of her father's familiar, powerful war cry. A sob of pure, soul-shattering anguish ripped from her throat. She knew, with a certainty that needed no sight, that he was gone. Kale, fighting like a demon near his chief, saw Dasoda fall. A roar of pure, animalistic rage erupted from him, and he charged, alone, directly at the line of soldiers. His knife held high. He was killed instantly, his body riddled with a dozen bullets before he had taken 5 steps. In a few short, brutal moments, the tribe's leadership, its strength, and its heart was annihilated. Elias reached Nalin's side amidst the horror. He grabbed her arm, shouting her name over the din. She flinched violently at his unexpected touch, a small, wounded cry escaping her lips. Before she recognized his scent, the familiar sound of his voice cutting through the chaos. There was no time for grief, no time for comfort. "We have to go, now!" he yelled, pulling her along, forcing her trembling legs to move. He knew the main escape routes, the ones the women and children were fleeing towards, would be watched and cut off. He pulled her towards a lesser-known, treacherous goat path that wound its way steeply up the sheer canyon wall, a path she had once described to him in meticulous detail. Their escape was a desperate, harrowing scramble for their lives. Elias moved in front, his larger body shielding hers as much as possible, his captured rifle in one hand, his other hand holding hers in an iron grip. He was her eyes, her guide through the chaos. He described the path in short, clipped, urgent commands. "Step up now. A high rock. Low branch. Duck your head. Loose rock to your left. Step wide." Bullets ricocheted off the rocks all around them, kicking up angry spurts of dust and sharp fragments of stone. They were a moving target, and it was only by a miracle of blind luck and Elias's grim, focused skill that they were not hit. They were not the only ones who managed to escape. A handful of others, mostly women and children, and a few wounded warriors, found their way out of the killing ground through various paths, scattering into the vast, unforgiving wilderness like frightened quail. The tribe was broken, its people scattered, its home destroyed, its spirit shattered. As Elias and Nalin finally reached a high, protected ledge, they could look down upon the smoking, smoldering ruins of the camp. The gunfire had mostly stopped, replaced now by the triumphant, drunken shouts of the soldiers and the chilling, businesslike sound of Croft's men moving among the bodies, making sure their work was complete. The beautiful, hidden canyon, a place of sanctuary for generations, had become a mass grave. The sight filled Elias with a cold, bottomless rage, but his face remained a stony, unreadable mask. He could not afford to feel anything yet. His only priority, his only purpose in the world, was Nalin. They were now fugitives in a hostile land that offered no shelter and no mercy. They had nothing but the clothes on their backs, a single rifle with a handful of cartridges, and a knife. The landscape, which had once been a home to Nalin, a place she knew with an intimacy deeper than sight, was now a threat. The cavalry would be sending out patrols to hunt for survivors, to finish the job. And, more menacingly, Croft and his men would be doing the same, wanting to ensure that there were no witnesses left alive to contradict their carefully crafted story. Elias and Nalin were both haunted and hunted. The love that was born in the quiet of a hidden cabin and tested in the fiery crucible of the camp was now all they had left in the world. It was no longer a source of stolen joy or secret passion, but a grim, silent pact of survival. The days that followed were a blur of hardship, fear, and grief. Elias used all his skill, all his knowledge of the land and of survival, to keep them alive and hidden. He found them shelter in a series of small, hidden caves, places no one would think to look. He found water where it seemed impossible, a small seep at the base of a rock, a patch of ground that held the morning dew. He hunted small game, rabbits and squirrels, with snares he fashioned from yucca fiber, not daring to use the rifle and give away their position with a gunshot. Nalin, despite the overwhelming shock and the deep ocean of grief she was drowning in, proved to be incredibly resilient. She was not a helpless burden. She was a partner in their survival. Her intimate knowledge of the land was vital. She could identify edible plants by their touch and smell alone. She knew which roots held water, which berries were safe to eat. They worked as a team. Their bond forged into something unbreakable by the shared trauma and the absolute, daily necessity of relying on one another. At night, in the cold, high desert, they would huddle together for warmth, finding a desperate comfort not in passion, but in the simple, profound act of holding on to another living, breathing soul in the face of utter desolation. Their hope was nearly extinguished, buried under the crushing weight of their losses. All that remained was the raw, animal will to survive, to endure one more day, and the love that bound them together in the heart of the immense, encroaching darkness. Weeks passed, turning into a month, and Elias and Aline existed as ghosts in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. They had found a temporary, precarious shelter in a network of ancient cliff dwellings, built into a sheer rock face high up on a remote, nearly inaccessible mesa. The dwellings, abandoned by a people long vanished, were silent witnesses to their own ghostly existence. The physical wounds of their ordeal had begun to heal, the cuts closing, the bruises fading, but the psychological scars were deep, raw, and festering. Naylin was mostly silent, withdrawn into a dark, quiet world of grief for her father, for her people, for the entire life that had been stolen from her. She moved through the days like a sleepwalker, her face a beautiful, tragic mask of loss. Elias watched over her with a heavy, aching heart, his own rage and sorrow a constant, cold weight in the center of his chest. The passionate, desperate love that had bloomed between them in the face of death had now settled into something quieter, deeper, and infinitely more sorrowful. It was a constant, silent vigil, a shared breath in the overwhelming silence of their profound loss. He knew this was not a life. It was a slow, lingering death. They could not hide in the ruins of a forgotten people forever. The coming winter, with its biting winds and deep snows, would make survival on the exposed mesa impossible. And he knew, with a cold certainty, that a man like Silas Croft would not be sated until every last Apache survivor was gone, every possible witness to his crimes silenced forever. A crucial, life-altering turning point came one evening as the sun began to set. Elias was watching Naylin as she sat at the edge of the cliff dwelling, her sightless eyes turned towards the west, as if she could feel the last dying warmth of the day on her skin. The setting sun painted the clouds in hues of orange and purple, a spectacle of heartbreaking beauty that she could not see. A single tear escaped from her eye and traced a slow, deliberate path down her cheek. In that small, silent moment of sorrow, he saw not just her grief, but the flicker of the indomitable spirit that lay buried beneath it, a single ember that had not yet been extinguished, and he realized, with a sudden, shocking clarity, that running and hiding was a betrayal of that spirit, a betrayal of the memory of her fierce, proud father, and of all the people who had died. Vengeance, he knew, was a fool's errand, a hot-blooded, self-destructive path that would only get them both killed. But justice, the cold, hard, methodical pursuit of the truth, the act of exposing Croft for the murderer he was, that was a sliver of hope worth fighting for. It was a chance, however slim, to give their losses some meaning. He made a decision. His voice, when he spoke into the quiet air, was soft but firm, leaving no room for argument. "I'm going back," he said. Naylin turned her head sharply, her expression one of sudden alarm. "Back to redemption." He moved to sit beside her on the cold stone. The vast expanse of the darkening world spread out before them. He explained his plan, his voice low and urgent. He could not bring back the dead. He could not restore the life she had lost. But he could make the man responsible pay for what he had done. He could stop him from profiting from their blood, from building his empire on the graves of her family. It was a desperate, almost suicidal plan, a single man against a powerful, respected monster. But it was better than sitting here, waiting for the winter or Croft's men to come and finish them off. Nalin was silent for a long time, the only sound the sigh of the wind through the empty dwellings. When she finally spoke, her voice was a near whisper, but it was filled with a strength that he had not heard in weeks. "Be the hawk, not the rabbit," she said, repeating a phrase her father had so often used. It was not a choice born of hope, but of pure, unyielding defiance. It was her blessing. Leaving Nalin was the hardest thing Elias had ever done. Before he left, he spent 2 days tracking, and in a nearby canyon, he found a few other survivors of the massacre. A wise old woman with eyes that held all the sorrow of her people. 2 young mothers and their 3 small, silent children. They were starving, hiding, waiting for the end. He led them to the relative safety of the cliff dwelling, knowing that they would be safer together, a small, shattered family clinging to existence. He entrusted Nalin to their care, a silent promise passing between him and the old woman, an understanding that transcended language. She would watch over Nalin, and in doing so, they would all watch over each other. The farewell between Elias and Nalin was heavy with the unspoken fear that it would be their last. He held her, his arms wrapped tightly around her, trying to memorize the feel of her in his arms, the scent of her hair, the shape of her face. "I will come back for you," he promised, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "I know," she replied, her hand resting flat against his chest, over his heart. Her absolute faith in him was a heavier burden and a greater strength than any weapon he could carry. Elias traveled to redemption not as the weary cowboy who had passed through weeks before, but as a predator, a hunter with a single purpose. He moved only at night, using all the scouting skills he possessed to remain unseen, a ghost slipping through the shadows of the land. The town was abuzz with talk of the great victory of Captain Wallace and the heroic actions of the local citizens. Silas Croft was being celebrated as a local hero, the man who had helped protect the good, God-fearing settlers from the savage hordes. He had already filed official claims on the land where DeSoto's camp was located, the rich grazing land and the precious water rights now his for the taking. Elias watched from the shadows, gathering information, his patience a cold, coiled thing. He knew that his word alone would mean nothing against a man like Croft. He needed proof, something undeniable. His first break came from an unexpected and unlikely source. He tracked down one of Croft's ranch hands, a young, guilt-ridden kid with fear in his eyes, a boy he had seen in the general store weeks ago. Elias did not use threats. He used the truth. He cornered the boy one night in the dark alley behind the saloon and spoke to him in a low, quiet voice. He did not speak of revenge. He spoke of justice. He described the massacre at the camp, the killing of women and children, the face of the old woman who had been murdered. He could see the flicker of shame and terror in the young man's eyes. Elias offered him a choice: remain a pawn in a murderer's game for the rest of his life, or find a way to live with himself again. The boy, terrified of Croft but sickened and haunted by what he had been a part of, eventually broke. He confessed everything in a torrent of whispered, desperate words. He told Elias how Croft had orchestrated the raid on the German settlers' homestead, and he even showed Elias where they had buried the family's clothes that Croft's men had worn as a disguise, a crucial piece of physical evidence. It was a solid piece of the puzzle, but Elias knew it was not enough to convict a man as powerful and as well-connected as Silas Croft. Elias knew he needed to turn the military itself against Croft. Through careful listening in the saloon, posing as a drifting prospector, he learned that while Captain Wallace was being praised in the territory, he was also being quietly scrutinized by his superiors at the Department of War. The sheer number of non-combatant casualties reported in his official account of the battle had raised uncomfortable questions in Washington. A more senior, by-the-book investigator, a major named Samuel Davis, had been sent from the headquarters in Santa Fe to file a formal, independent report. This was his chance. Elias knew he had to get to Major Davis before Croft could get to him. before Croft could poison him with his own self-serving version of events. He used his tracking skills to intercept the Major's small escort on the trail. Several days out from redemption, he approached them openly, in broad daylight, under a white flag of truce. The soldiers were initially hostile, their rifles trained on him, but Elias's bearing, the unmistakable confidence and discipline of a former soldier himself, and the raw urgency in his voice convinced them to listen. He laid out the evidence he had gathered, presenting a concise, logical, and damning account of Silas Croft's manipulations, culminating in the information he had gotten from the repentant ranch hand, Major Davis, a cautious, intelligent officer in his late 40s, a man who valued truth above glory, was skeptical but intrigued. He agreed to investigate Elias's claims, placing Elias in a state of unofficial custody until the matter could be resolved. The final confrontation took place not in a dusty street gunfight at high noon, but in a tense, formal hearing convened by Major Davis in the town hall. Silas Croft was there, arrogant, confident, and smiling, with a nervous Captain Wallace by his side. Elias stood as the sole accuser, his appearance rough and trail-worn, but his gaze steady and unwavering. He presented his case logically and without emotion, laying out the facts as he knew them. Croft scoffed and denied everything, painting Elias as a bitter liar and an Indian lover, a traitor to his own kind. The tide began to turn when Major Davis, to the shock of everyone in the room, produced the young ranch hand, the boy, protected by the formidable presence of the Major's armed soldiers, confessed everything. His voice trembled as he recounted the cold-blooded murder of the settler family and the subsequent framing of the Apache. The final, damning piece of evidence was the discovery of the buried clothing. Dug up from the very spot the boy had indicated, Captain Wallace, realizing in a moment of cold panic that he had been made a fool and that his career was in ruins, turned on Croft, desperately trying to save himself by corroborating parts of Elias's story about how Croft had guided him, manipulated him, and fed him false information. Silas Croft, seeing his world, his empire, and his reputation crumbling to dust around him, did not surrender. In a final, desperate act of violent defiance, he drew a small, hidden pistol from his boot, attempting to kill Elias and shoot his way out of the town hall. But Elias was ready. He had been expecting it. His draw was faster, the movement a blur. A single, precise shot that tore the pistol from Croft's hand, disarming him without killing him. The sharp crack of the pistol shot echoed in the stunned silence of the room, a sound of finality, the sound of justice being served. Croft, clutching his wounded hand, was apprehended by the Major's soldiers, his reign of terror over. For Elias, there was no triumph, no sense of victory, only a profound, soul-deep, aching weariness. He had won, but the cost was immeasurable. The aftermath was bittersweet and steeped in the quiet tragedy of what could not be undone. Silas Croft was taken away in chains for a federal trial he would not win. Captain Wallace would face a court-martial and the ignominious end of his military career. The official report filed by Major Davis would acknowledge the massacre, a small, bureaucratic stain on the blood-soaked pages of history. But nothing could bring back the dead. The Apache land, the reason for all the bloodshed, was gone forever, their people scattered to the winds, destined for the slow death of the reservations. Justice, Elias discovered, was a pale, inadequate comfort for such a profound and irreversible loss. Elias, cleared of any wrongdoing, rode back to the high mesa, when Nalin, from her perch at the edge of the cliff, heard the familiar, steady rhythm of his approaching footsteps on the ancient stone. She ran towards the sound, her own steps sure and certain. They met in a desperate, clinging embrace. Two survivors of a storm that had taken everything from them. Their future was a blank, unwritten page. They could not return to her world, for it was destroyed. They could not return to his, for it had no place for them. They had lost their homes, their families, their pasts. All they had was each other, a bond forged in the darkest of tragedies and tempered by a love that had refused to be extinguished. As they stood together on the edge of the cliff, looking out over the vast, beautiful, and indifferent landscape, the story ends not with a promise of happiness, but with a fragile, hard-won glimmer of hope. They would leave this blood-soaked land behind and walk forward together, carrying their scars and their love into an unknown future, their survival a quiet, powerful testament to the incredible resilience of the human heart. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to our From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.